Perhaps we could begin with China. Seems an apt place to start, given what we heard from the Chinese government just a couple of days ago. Does the timing of this yuan revaluation so close to the G20 summit signal anything to you?
Well, it's on the negative side. It signals that they didn't want to discuss it at the G20 summit, and that the Chinese government is extraordinarily sensitive about having what it considers its domestic decisions subject to an international debate. On the positive side, the fact that they are doing it shows that they are responding to what we and a number of other countries have indicated is important for global recovery. So altogether, it's a positive decision.
On balance, do you believe that China is acting to revalue the yuan more for domestic reasons, or because of what you just said, that they have,
for China,
that they want to respond in some way to what they perceive to be international pressure?
For China, it's always a combination of factors. For domestic reasons, they would prefer not to revalue, because their export industry is one of their, maybe the most high employment industry, and they fear that it will reduce their exports to some extent. But good relations with the United States are important elements also for their domestic evolution. So I think it's a mix of domestic and foreign considerations, and they are deeply concerned always not to give the impression that they have yielded to foreign pressure. It's the history of the 19th century where they were sort of the subject of foreign pressures and advice. So in dealing with the Chinese, it's always essential to respect their perception of their dignity.
But nevertheless, we should interpret this as a clear sign that they are aware and
very positive sign.
You have praised Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner's handling of this currency debate. Should this be viewed as a victory for Geithner?
Well, I hate to look at it as a victory because that implies that it's a Chinese defeat. I think the skill of Geithner in this particular situation derived from the fact that at some point earlier this year, he decided that beating up on the Chinese and threatening them with domestic legislation was not the way to go, and that to talk to them on the basis of mutuality of interest and of common necessities would be better. And I would say starting about April, that is the line he has pursued, and he took that unscheduled trip to Beijing. So it's a demonstration of its effectiveness and of the fact that he avoided turning it into a victory and defeat situation.
On the domestic front for Tim Geithner, though, is there not a risk that if the Chinese policy does not translate into a meaningful strengthening of the yuan over the next several months, he could face renewed pressure to take a harder line from his opponents in Congress?
It's not a meaningful contribution to the UN. It's a contribution to the international economic system. There are various elements in the Congress. There are some that will never be satisfied. But I believe that the reasonable elements on both sides of the aisle need to be satisfied. And it is a kind of a test. But I think the Chinese, once they have made the basic decision, don't want to pay twice whatever domestic price they pay, and then on top of it pay a price here for having it inadequate.
It seems that the Chinese are really trying to accomplish such a delicate balancing act here. As you've explained, there are potential consequences on the domestic front, especially as it concerns lower-end exporters, let's say. They're also, it seems, trying to use this as a policy instrument to keep the economy from overheating potentially. they want to stimulate domestic demand so that they're less reliant on exporters. Within that calculus, is there a serious risk for China here?
China has been walking a tightrope for over a decade, because when you develop a country with high-end development at one end of the country and rather substantial underdevelopment in the eastern part, but this is another aspect of it, of a very complicated balancing act that they always have to perform.
On that front, though, are we seeing, in your opinion, danger signs emerging with strikes at Honda and Toyota, the suicides at Foxconn, the maker of the iPhone?
Well, when you have a rapid development of 10% a year for such a long period of time and such enormous changes in demographic composition and in style of life, yes, they are having a big challenge of how to bring their society along in this complex situation. And I think for them, domestic policy right now takes precedence over foreign policy.
For how much longer can China manage successfully a centrally planned economy?
Well, their economy isn't really centrally planned. It is more planned than our economy, but it has a very substantial market sector, and many of the day-to-day decisions are done on a market basis. So far, they have proved amazingly nimble. Last year, when the economic crisis hit the world, for a moment it looked as if China might be more affected than most other countries, and they, with enormous dexterity, moved into a stimulus program and took care of about 30 million unemployed. Can they do it year after year? Well, their record so far has been good, but it's a tremendous tour de force.
Now, as the economy becomes more market-oriented and as that market element of the economy becomes larger, does it become that much more difficult for the central government to manage it,
well,
in addition to everything
else?
else?
Difficult is that you now have, in the nature of things, so many entities emerging in so many interest groups that they have to be balanced just as you do in a democratic system. If you have no legislature, then there are other avenues of expression, so that the Chinese society is becoming more and more complex, and therefore it can't be managed anymore the way it was in the time when I got to know them, when Mao and even Deng had pretty unchallenged authority.
Dr. Kissinger, much is made of China's tremendous holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds. Do you think that China would ever, clearly under different circumstances than what we see today, but ever use the so-called nuclear option and begin either threaten to sell those Treasury bonds or actually do it to try and put pressure on the U.S. government one way or another?
Well, as a basic principle, China will do what its perception of the national interest dictates. But China, the Chinese leaders that I've met now over several generations have been the most careful analysts of the situation in which they find themselves at any moment that I have encountered. So for them to take this step would be a measure of such magnitude that it could occur only under conditions of a break with the United States that I can't foresee. It would be very uncharacteristic for them to do it. Is a total clash between us conceivable? Really only if statesmanship on both sides breaks down.
Dr. Kissinger, moving on from China, looking around the globe, what do you see as the single greatest geopolitical risk right now to global stability?
In the long term, I think the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And for that reason, Iran and that whole region, Iran, Afghanistan, Middle East, are in the middle and short term, the dominant risks.
And in the short run, anything more alarming or perhaps more threatening than nuclear weapons?
I don't know what can be much
Well, not
more.
so much more, but perhaps something we might see take place sooner.
Well, we will have to take some decisions on Iranian negotiations within the next year. We are engaged now in a domestic debate over Afghanistan, which will grow even more after the comments of the commander in
General McChrystal.
General McChrystal. Those seem to me, in the short term, the dominant scenes.
Now, how about what's going on in Europe? The sovereign debt crisis continues. There's been...
The sovereign debt crisis in Europe could turn into the equivalent of Lehman bankruptcy here. But there is so much at stake for the European countries because it would really threaten the dissolution of the European Union that it would be such a collapse of statesmanship in Europe that I think some way will be found to deal with it.
Well, is it Germany that holds the card that decides whether that game goes in the direction of Lehman?
At some point, this turns into an allocation of pain, and who will have to carry the burden of the pain. And it's of course hard to sell to a country the proposition that because it has been responsible and therefore has additional resources, it has to pay for the countries that have been less responsible and to bail them out so that there's almost a penalty for having been responsible. And given the German history with inflation, it's a very painful process. Germany is blamed in many countries today for having been somewhat reluctant. But the fact is, inside Germany, most of the troubles that the German government has is because the German public thinks they made too many concessions. But there's no doubt that as the crisis evolves, the demands on Germany will increase. But I'm looking at the Latin American debt crisis issue, in which there were a similar set of problems. And right now, all these discussions are on the basis of the banks being made 100% whole. That didn't prove possible in Latin America. I don't think it will prove possible in Europe. And so the question is how much pain can be allocated and preserving the banking system and avoiding a political disintegration. That's the tightrope that has to be walked.
Are policymakers, though, doing the right thing by, so to speak, kicking the can down the road, adopting policies that try to forestall the pain?
It's the right thing if they're using the time to understand the problem and dealing with it. It's the wrong thing if they just consider the absence of pain a policy and then wait for the next blow to fall, hopefully on some other government.
But what do you think they're doing?
They're tempted to do both. And it's always easier to avoid action that is difficult. They may understand the theory of what I put forward, but when it comes to the practice, there's an advantage in being a new government like Britain, because you can blame it on your predecessor, do it all at once, because otherwise you'll have to do it 2-3 years from now anyway and bear the full responsibility.